High-stakes warfare is often decided by the silent ticking of a clock rather than the thunder of guns. In early 2026, the world witnessed a masterclass in calculated destruction centered on a single piece of concrete. The Antonivsky Bridge was no longer just a transit point, it was a $600 million logistical juggernaut. By mid-January, the atmosphere in Moscow was thick with the tension of failing diplomacy. While diplomats argued over dinner tables, Ukrainian military analysts were already looking at blueprints. The bridge served as the vital artery for the Russian southern front, pumping supplies from the east. Russia's primary demand was a guarantee of safety for this specific logistics corridor. They wanted a total cessation of drone activity and technical accidents around the Dnipro crossings. Ukraine's refusal was swift and final, ending the talks without a single word of agreement. The diplomatic mission was officially terminated in a cloud of uncertainty. However, for those in the secure rooms of Kyiv, the end of words meant the beginning of action. A secret command session was initiated just after the failed talks ended. No paper trail was left behind to record the decisions made during those dark hours. The mission was singular. The Antonivsky Bridge had to be rendered useless. It wasn't about revenge, it was about the cold mathematics of supply and demand. Russia assumed the talks had bought them a window of safety to move their heavy convoys. Ukraine was counting on that exact assumption to trap them in a corridor of fire. Russian planners were already issuing orders to push supplies forward aggressively. They viewed the failed negotiations as a prompt to secure their positions before dawn. A massive convoy began to form, consisting of 412 specialized military vehicles. The cargo was immense: 1,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and mechanized spare parts. These supplies were intended to keep two full mechanized brigades fighting for over a week. Command selected the Antonivsky Bridge for the crossing, deeming it a low-risk environment. Their intelligence suggested Ukraine lacked the political guts to strike so soon after high-level talks. Security measures were focused almost entirely on high-altitude threats. Nebo-M radar systems scanned the clouds for incoming missiles or jets. Panzer S-1 units were peppered along the banks, eyes fixed on the horizon. Yet the area beneath the bridge was a graveyard of surveillance. No infantry patrols guarded the waterline, and no sensors monitored the structural pillars. This was a fatal oversight born from a mixture of arrogance and anger. The Russian officers felt that any delay in movement would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. They didn't know that their entire route had been modeled and predicted days in advance. While the engines of the 6-kilometer-long convoy roared, Ukraine's plan was already in its final phase. The operation was a blend of patience and high-tech sabotage. 5 nights prior, a silent insertion had occurred under the cover of a satellite blind spot. Precisely 16 FPV drones had been attached to the eastern span using electromagnetic clamps. The drones were small, each carrying a payload of less than 3 kilograms of high explosives. To a casual inspector, they would look like pieces of discarded industrial debris. These units weren't using GPS, they were running on internal structural models. Over 2 million simulations had been run to find the perfect points of failure. The margin of error for the strike was narrowed down to a single centimeter. For 96 hours, these drones sat inert, waiting for a signal that would never be broadcast over the air. They withstood the vibrations of thousands of tons of armor crossing above them. On the day of the disaster, the massive convoy began its final approach. The logistical value of the column was estimated at a staggering $520 million. As the lead vehicles touched the asphalt of the bridge, the world around them was eerily silent. No artillery shells fell, and no warning lights flickered on the Russian dashboards. This silence was a psychological trap that encouraged the convoy to close its gaps. Spacing regulations were abandoned in favor of speed and efficiency.
The bridge was becoming a dense mass of metal and explosives. The Russian commanders misread the lack of resistance as Ukrainian hesitation. They pushed more trucks onto the span, unaware they were creating a pressure cooker. The dependency on the bridge reached its peak at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, a mechanical failure occurred near the center of the span. A heavy transport truck stalled, causing a chain reaction of emergency braking. In less than 2 minutes, 70 vehicles were trapped nose to tail in a stationary line. The weight on the structure soared to over 8,000 tons. Ukrainian monitoring software flagged the situation immediately. The probability of a successful structural collapse jumped from 38% to 91%. Timing turned a contingency plan into an inevitable catastrophe. Russian radios were filled with conflicting orders and panicked shouts. Some were told to push forward, while others tried to reverse into the oncoming traffic. The bridge was no longer a road, it was a localized crisis zone. The first electronic warnings began to surface within the Russian systems. A Pantsir S-1 operator noticed strange fluctuations coming from beneath the concrete. The signal was weak, but the heightened tension forced a reactive response. Without waiting for orders, the air defense unit switched to active scanning. This move flooded the area with radar energy, reflecting off every piece of rebar in the bridge. To the automated systems, it appeared as if the bridge was crawling with targets. A defensive missile was fired, targeting a simple decoy. A $160,000 interceptor destroyed a $60 piece of plastic and metal. The resulting explosion caused further panic among the drivers below. Collisions occurred as trucks tried to flee the perceived airstrike. The air defense network began to interfere with itself as more systems went active. In an attempt to clarify the chaos, commanders called for airborne support. An A-50 radar plane was diverted to scan the river. From its high-altitude perch, it finally saw the thermal signatures of the hidden drones. The data was fed directly to an S-400 battery located 80 kilometers away. An interceptor missile was launched with a price tag of $3 million. As the missile closed in, a fiber-optic decoy was deployed by one of the drones. The decoy amplified the radar signature, tricking the S-400 into a harmless detonation. For 10 critical seconds, the Russian defense was blind and distracted. The FPV drones finally woke up and detached from their clamps. They didn't aim for the trucks, they aimed for the structural joints of the bridge. The strike was surgical, hitting the exact points where the 8,000-ton load was heaviest. There was no giant fireball, only the sound of snapping steel and cracking concrete. The central span of the bridge began to give way under the sheer force of physics. By sunrise, a 600-meter gap had opened in the middle of the Dnipro. The convoy was severed, leaving 200 vehicles trapped on the wrong side of the river. Over 900 tons of ammunition were now ducks for future strikes. The logistical fallout was immediate and devastating for the Russian Southern Command. Frontline units were left with less than 3 days of supplies. All offensive operations planned for the next week were scrapped. The political leverage Russia had hoped for in Moscow had vanished into the water. The cost to Ukraine was a few $1,000s in hardware. The cost to Russia was measured in the hundreds of millions and lost momentum. The sun rose on a battlefield that had changed forever without a single tank battle. It was a victory of data over hardware and timing over strength. The Antonivsky Bridge became a monument to the failure of traditional assumptions. Modern war is no longer a game of who has the most, but who knows the most. When the bridge fell, so did the illusion of Russia's logistical security. This event redefined the cost of doing business on the Ukrainian front. Every driver on that bridge became a witness to the precision of the 21st century. The drones had done what an entire artillery battalion could not. They proved that infrastructure is a weapon when used against its owner.
The Russian command was left to pick up the pieces of a broken strategy. Meanwhile, the world watched as a $600 million asset crumbled into the river. It was a cold reminder that diplomacy is only as strong as your weakest link. For Ukraine, the bridge was a target. For Russia, it was a trap. The failure of the Moscow talks was the trigger for the first drone to detach. Calculation had replaced chaos in the Ukrainian war room. No one expected the strike to be this clean or this effective. The use of electromagnetic clamps was a stroke of genius. It allowed the drones to hide in plain sight for days. The Russian radar systems were tuned for a war that wasn't happening. They were looking up while the threat was literally underneath their feet. This asymmetry is the hallmark of modern conflict. A $3 million missile is useless against a drone it cannot see. The A-50 aircraft's intervention came too late to save the crossing. The decoy tactics showed a deep understanding of Russian electronic warfare. By the time the dust settled, the southern front was paralyzed. The 6-kilometer convoy became a 6-kilometer graveyard of ambition. Fuel tankers sat motionless, unable to move forward or back. The ammunition carriers were heavy with a cargo that would never be fired. This was the moment the logistical war was won in the south. No massive invasion was needed to halt the Russian advance. Only 16 drones and the right timing. The engineering blueprints of the bridge were its own undoing. Ukraine used Russia's own infrastructure data against them. Every stress point was mapped, simulated, and then exploited. The result was a structural failure that looked like an accident of physics. But there are no accidents in this level of warfare. Every second was scripted by analysts in Kyiv. The stalled truck was the final piece of the puzzle. It provided the mass needed to ensure the bridge would buckle. Russian arrogance provided the rest of the ingredients. They believed they were safe because they had asked for safety. In war, asking for safety is an admission of vulnerability. Ukraine didn't just break a bridge, they broke a promise of security. The economic impact on the Russian military budget will be felt for years. Replacing such a corridor during an active conflict is nearly impossible. The pontoon bridges that followed were easily picked off by artillery. The Antonivsky Bridge was unique, and now it is gone. Its destruction serves as a warning to any army relying on fixed points. Mobility is the only defense in a world of precision strikes. The Russian soldiers on the bridge that morning knew the war had changed. They felt the vibration of the collapse before they heard the drones. It was a silent, terrifying realization. Diplomacy had failed them, and now physics was finishing the job. The Moscow security offices were silent when the news arrived. There were no joint statements to be made now. Only the reality of a severed supply line remained. The southern front was effectively an island. Cut off from the east, the troops faced a bleak winter. This operation will be studied in military academies for decades. It is the perfect example of logistics as a battlefield. Ukraine showed that you don't need to kill every soldier to stop an army. You just need to stop their food, their fuel, and their bullets. The Antonivsky Bridge was the throat of the Russian army, and it was squeezed. The 412 vehicles are now a logistical nightmare to recover. They block the very roads they were meant to travel. This is the irony of a failed logistics push. The supplies themselves become the obstacle. The $600 million loss is just the beginning of the cost. The loss of time is far more expensive in a war of attrition. Ukraine has seized the initiative by doing nothing for 4 days. Their patience was their greatest weapon. They waited for the perfect moment of maximum density. They waited for the enemy to feel safe, and then they acted with absolute precision. The use of low-cost drones against high-cost infrastructure is the new norm. It is a financial war as much as a physical one. Russia cannot afford to lose many more $600 million assets. Ukraine can afford to lose thousands of $500 drones.
This math does not favor the occupier. As the sun climbed higher and higher, the scale of the disaster became clear. The bridge was a twisted skeleton of its former self. The Dnipro River flowed beneath the wreckage, indifferent to the war. But the war would never be the same after this night. The psychological blow to the Russian high command was immense. They had been outsmarted at every turn. Their air defenses had been tricked by toys, their logistics had been trapped by physics, and their diplomacy had been ignored. This is the reality of the Ukrainian resistance. It is smart, it is lean, and it is deadly. They don't fight fair, they fight to win. The Antonivsky Bridge operation was a masterpiece of asymmetry. It turned a defensive structure into an offensive liability. Every ton of ammunition on that bridge became a threat to the bridge itself. The Russian commanders had forgotten that bridges are two-way streets. They can bring you to the fight, or they can leave you stranded. They chose to ignore the risks on January 18th. The world should take note of how this unfolded. It wasn't about who had the most firepower, it was about who knew how to use the environment better. Ukraine transformed the river and the bridge into a trap. They used the enemy's own weight to destroy them. This is the ultimate form of logistical efficiency. The debris in the sky from the S-400 was a fireworks show for a funeral, the funeral of the Russian southern strategy. No amount of propaganda can hide a broken bridge. No joint statement can reconnect those spans. The logistics corridor is closed, and the price has been paid. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, what is next? If a bridge can be taken down with 16 small drones, what else is at risk? Pipelines, power grids, and data centers are all vulnerable. The battlefield is everywhere there is a dependency. Ukraine has mapped these dependencies with terrifying accuracy. Russia is playing a game of checkers while Ukraine is running a simulation. The gap between them is wider than the 600 meters in the bridge. It is a gap in understanding, in technology, and in will. The Antonivsky Bridge strike was not a one-off event. It was a proof of concept for the next phase of the war, a phase where the invisible becomes the most dangerous, and where silence is the loudest warning of all. The Russian convoy is still there, a ghost of a failed plan. It serves as a warning to anyone who mistakes a lack of movement for a lack of intent. Ukraine intended to break the bridge from the moment the talks began. They were just waiting for the right ton of pressure. They found that pressure exactly when they needed it. The world is watching the footage of the collapse now. It is a slow-motion disaster that defines an era where a $600 million battlefield can be created in seconds, and the cost of failed diplomacy is measured in concrete and steel. The lesson is clear. Don't depend on what you cannot protect, and don't assume your enemy isn't already under your feet. The bridge is down, the convoy is trapped, and the front has shifted, all because of 16 drones and a few hours of failed talk. This is the new face of war, and it is uncompromising. As the dust settles, the search for new vulnerabilities begins. Somewhere another bridge is being modeled, another convoy is being tracked, and another diplomat is wasting their breath. The real work is happening in the shadows and the simulations. The Antonivsky Bridge strike was just the beginning. In the age of precision, nowhere is truly safe. What do you think will be the next unbreakable asset to fall? Join the conversation below and stay tuned for more deep dives into the mechanics of modern war.